A sound plan for honor. A
我们
sound
这边
plan.
一堆要专武的。哦，我刚好像看到关羽，对不对？
Of course.
我刚好像看到关羽，
Certainly.
没错。
For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Foul. Certainly. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Betrayal. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. For my father. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Of
但不
course.
怕死。
Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan.
然后去买绷带了，给他去买吧。
For honor. Certainly. For honor.
应该已经上去了吧？
Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. Foul name. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Betrayer of light. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. For honor.
妈的，脚给卡到了，
Certainly.
血量不够啊，妈别跳舞。
For honor. A sound plan. Of course.
这边在戳
Certainly. A sound plan. Of
把
course.
血拉满，
For
突
honor.
然间一戳，
A sound plan. Certainly. Justice is coming. Of course. For honor. Of course. For honor. You are past redemption. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A
别
sound
跳舞，
plan.
不行欸，
Our hero has
刚不想
fallen.
打的，刚想说让他跳完再那个，血量不够。
The light is my strength. Justice shall be done. Of course. I stand for the light. Certainly.
谢谢微良的
Of course.
32个月，
For honor.
感谢，好
Certainly.
快哦，竟然快3年了。
Of course. For honor. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. Foul. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. For my father. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. The light is my strength. Justice shall be done. Of course. For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course.
Our allies' town is under siege.
哦，张鸟加朱然哦，下路这组很难打哦，
A sound plan.
这狗干难打的。
For honor. The light is my strength. Certainly. Justice sound plan.
Our allies' town is under siege.
Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor.
Our allies' town is under
下路
siege.
感觉
Stand for the light.
好像出不去了，
A sound
还是要断兵，感觉得断兵了。
Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. For
Our
honor.
allies' town is under siege.
回去，
Of course.
再飞过来。
Certainly. Is there danger? For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Of course.
Our allies' town is under siege.
Certainly. For honor. Certainly.
被抢了就不会啊。
Of course. For honor.
Betrayal of light.
Certainly. For honor. Of course. For honor. Of course.
Our allies' town is under
For
siege.
honor. Certainly.
干啊！脚
Certainly.
都没瞧好，我应该杀到
For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. For honor. For my father. Certainly. For honor. Of course. A sound plan.
Our allies' town is
Certainly.
under siege.
Of course.
Our forces
sound
are under attack.
For honor. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. Justice has come. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. For Lord Orion. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor.
Our hero has
这
fallen.
样不错。
Our allies' hero has fallen.
我打不动。
Justice shall be
Our allies' town is
哪个
under
装吧？
siege.
想想看，
a sound plan. Certainly.
不要买新
I
钢。
stand for the light.
Our allies' town is under siege.
看来我是要协辅了。
Is there danger?
对面都一
I
堆力
stand for
出
the
协辅啊
light.。A sound plan.
The
Is there
dead shall
danger?
serve.
Certainly. For honor. I stand for the light. Of course. Justice shall be done. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. I'm here to help. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. For my father, the king. Certainly. A sound plan.
Allies' hero has fallen.
Of course. For honor.
Allies' town is under
A
siege.
sound plan. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. For honor.
我推你啊！
Certainly. Of course.
Our allies' town is under siege.
Sound plan. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan.
可是这关羽真的超没默契的呢。
Our allies' town
我想要推他过去，他一直往前走，
Certainly. For honor.
我不要跟他配合好了，我跟他搭不起来。
Certainly. A sound plan.
you are passing down.
Of course.
Our allies' town is under siege.
Of course. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Of course.
Betrayer of the light.
For honor. Of course. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. For Lord of Rome. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. I stand for the light. Justice shall be done. For honor. A sound plan. I stand for the light. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Justice shall be done. A sound plan.
Forces are under attack.
A sound plan. Certainly. For honor.
You are passing. Our allies' town is under siege.
A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. Of course. For honor.
Our allies'
Of course.
hero has fallen.
For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Is there danger?
My life. Our allies'
For
town
honor.
is under siege.
Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor.
Our allies'
course.
town is under siege.
For honor. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. For my father, the king. A sound plan. Justice shall be done. Certainly. A sound plan.
Our allies' town is under siege.
For honor. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. For Lord Orion. A sound plan.
Town is under
For
siege.
honor. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Foul. For honor. A sound plan. Justice has come. Certainly. Of course. For
Our
honor.
allies' town is under siege.
OK，石油等。
For honor. A sound plan.
等一下还有个霸
Of
王，
course. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. For honor.
Our allies' town is under siege.
For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. A sound. I'm here to help. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan.
我先去期待，
I'm here to help.
打得稳。
Of course. A sound plan.
Our allies'
Of course.
town is under siege.
Justice shall be done. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. A
Our
sound
allies' town is under siege.
让他少吃点。
Of course.
在挂网，然后退之后发在原地不动。
For honor. The light is strength.
Our allies' town is under siege.
Certainly. Of course. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of
要
course.
霸王还有期待。
Certainly.
You are past redemption.
Of course. Certainly. For honor.
Betrayer of the light.
Certainly.
哇，这个飞剑全部戳我，好痛！干，超痛的嘞，伤小啊！干，
I'm here to
太
help.
扯了吧，这么痛啊
For！honor.
我靠，超痛的耶，
Of course.
那差点被秒掉哎！有那么痛吗？
Forces are under attack.
真小，
Of course. Certainly.
Our allies' hero
Of
has
course.
fallen.
I'm here to help. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan.
可以啊。
Certainly. Of course. For honor. I
他
stand.
没大，
Certainly. Of course. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Of course. Justice shall be done. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan.
Justice is found.
Certainly. For honor. Certainly.
突然故障。
I'm here to help. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. For my father. Foul knave.
Justice is come.
Of course. Certainly.
他
A
补
sound
我，
plan.
我要等他补。
Of course. For honor. A sound plan.
先撤
Of course. For honor. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Justice shall be done. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly.
打死。
For honor. Certainly. For honor. Certainly.
这个人打吗？我觉得有
A
点
sound
危险。
plan. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Of course.
干，飞剑超戳的啦，靠背嘞！
Our hero has
干，为什么要戳我啦？妈的嘞，受不了了！那个飞剑戳成这样怎样啊？看不出我先撞个霸王，飞剑戳加张辽反弹，超麻烦。
I'm here to help. For justice shall be done. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. For honor.
空的，
Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly.
You are past redemption.
A sound plan.
我先把霸王合起来。
strength.
Our allied hero has fallen.
他那个在第几了？
Is there danger? Certainly. Justice shall.
Our allied hero has fallen.
Of course.
Our
there
allies'
danger?
town is under siege.
等一下还有个期待。
For honor. Certainly. Of course. Stand for the light. Certainly. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. For Lord Oran. A sound plan. Certainly. A
为什么这个要
sound
拉我
plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan.
Our hero has fallen. Our allied town is under siege.
有被为什么不放眼？ 他应该没打吧？
Town is under siege.
Of course.
剩一个张辽吧，张辽应该过去吗？没有过去的。
Certainly. Of course. A sound
Feel my wrath.
for honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. A sound certainly. Of course. Certainly. Of course. I
你
stand.
这边3把邪斧，
Certainly. Of course. For honor. Certainly.
然后我想说让马代射有没有
Of
痛？
course.
因为他是邪斧。
Certainly. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Of course. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan.
Our allies' hero has fallen.
Of course. For honor. Certainly. Of course. For honor. A sound
Our
plan.
allies' town is under siege.
Of course. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan.
可以拉我吗？
Of course. A sound plan.
我去买一下音枪
A sound，
回去后写补装5
For honor. Of course. A sound plan. The light is my strength.
扫屁的属性蛮烂的，
Certainly.
已经没有伤害了，然后又抽到日属性，
Of course.
基本上可以无视草壁，因为他没有伤害。
Certain. What does the shadow for honor? Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Of course. For honor. Of course. I stand for the light. Certainly. For honor. Of course.
Our allies' town is under
course, a sound plan. Of course, for honor. A sound plan. For honor. Of course, for honor. Of course, certainly. For honor. A
我们这
sound
边3把血斧是超快的，
of course, certainly.
应该是强化过的黄龙，还是很快。 干超多血斧，
Of course,
想要这个下
for
路。
honor. Of course.
Our allied town is under siege.
For honor. A sound plan. Certainly.
这还是马代还没来的情况下，马代如果来的话，3把血斧。
For honor.
Our allied town is under siege.
Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Feel my breath. I'm here to help.
Our allied town is under siege.
没伤害。
Shall be done. Certainly. Of course. You are a sound plan. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. For honor.
Where shall my blood be
Of course.
spilled?
Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. A
Our
sound
allied
plan.
town is under
水晶
siege.
期待吗？还是直接上？
A sound plan. Of course. A sound
可以直接上，他们爆炸，
Certainly.
完全 hold 不住。
Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Is there danger? I'm here to help. I stand for the light. The light is my strength. I'm here to help. I stand for the light.
想缺没人买我就买吧。
Certainly. Of course. Certainly. Of course. For my father, the king. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. You are past redemption.
没有庄武，他们应该也是输面很大，因为马代很肥，马代算是肥，
For honor. For my
但光
father.
马代也扛不太住啊。
Certainly.
Hero has fallen.
For
哎，
honor.
2个塔都没吃到，怎样？
Certainly. Stop. Of course. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound. For honor. Of course. For my father, the king. Certainly. For honor.
Betrayer of the light.
Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Certainly.
靠腰，这个也不知道
Hero。has fallen.
I'm here to help.
Our
I
allies'
stand for
hero
the
has
light.
fallen.
Justice shall
Allies'
be
hero
done.
has fallen.
Is there danger? A sound plan. The light is my strength. For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course.
马超
For honor.
斜斧滚枪，
Is there danger? Of course.
马超的装基本上都是一定是斜斧滚枪啊，这两个大概是8、9不离10
A sound plan. Certainly.
不太有什么变化
Of。course. Certainly. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. The light is my strength. Of course. I'm here to help. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. Of
你
course.
是问我还是问刘备
A？sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. Feel my wrath. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Justice is coming. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. Of course. You are past redemption.
帮大家加100块。E-boy 死掉了，
Certainly.
帮大家加薪。
Of course. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. For my father's house. A
哪来是
sound
我？
plan.
不是大家都是装五吗？
The light.
不是人人都装五。刘备也要装，刘备也要装五了。
Of course. For honor. Certainly.
这是一个装五没血世界。
For honor. Of course. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan.
那个反弹离心真的好烦，我这样敲自己，敲到自己会扣血。
Certainly. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course.
可以把滚枪挥出来。
Certainly. A sound plan. The rest was dead for wings. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan.
Allies' hero has fallen.
Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Certainly.
Hero has fallen.
Certainly. Of course. Certainly.
我们这边好多装五哦，太多了呢。
Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly.
GG 了。不过这场不好玩啊，特烂了。